for stopping by Sheila's audiobooks, and I am Sheila. This recording is coming from South Texas. All stories on this recording are in the public domain per United States copyright law. This story is about something horrible happens one night at the Villa Rose in Aix-les-baines. No one knows exactly what. The body of a rich old woman who believes in the spirits and owns a fortune in jewels is strangled to death. The maidservant is chloroformed in her room, and the charming young Mlle Celia, who has learned all the tricks of performing séances, has gone without a trace. And the case involves a gang of hardened criminals. Fortunately, the great detective Monsieur Hanaud is taking on the case. He allows a well-meaning, wealthy, middle-aged English tourist named Mr. Ricardo to tag along on the investigation. Hanaud is as shrewd, observant and devious as the criminals. "I was in a bad mind," said Celia, when asked by the juge d'instruction to explain that attack of nerves in the garden which Ricardo had witnessed. "I hated more and more the thought of the séance which was to take place on the morrow. I felt that I was disloyal to Harry. My nerves were all tingling. I was not nice that night at all," she added quaintly. "But at dinner I determined that if I met Harry after dinner, as I was sure to do, I would tell him the whole truth about myself. However, when I did meet him I was frightened. I knew how stern he could suddenly look. I dreaded what he would think. I was too afraid that I should lose him. No, I could not speak, I had not the courage. That made me still more angry with myself, and so I quarreled at once with Harry." He was surprised, but it was natural, wasn't it? What else should one do under such circumstances except quarrel with the man one loved? "Yes, I really quarreled with him, and said things which I thought and hoped would hurt. Then I ran away from him lest I should break down and cry. I went to the tables and lost at once all the money I had except one note of 5 louis. But that did not console me. And I ran out into the garden, very unhappy. There I behaved like a child, and Mr. Ricardo saw me. But it was not the little money I had lost which troubled me, no, it was the thought of what a coward I was. Afterwards Harry and I made it up, and I thought, like the little fool I was, that he wanted to ask me to marry him. But I would not let him that night. Oh, I wanted him to ask me, I was longing for him to ask me, but not that night. Somehow I felt that the séance and the tricks must be all over and done with before I could listen or answer." The quiet and simple confession touched the magistrate, who listened to it with profound pity. He shaded his eyes with his hand. The girl's sense of her unworthiness, the love she had given so unstintingly to Harry Wethermill, the deep pride she had felt in the delusion that he loved her too, had in it an irony too bitter. But he was aroused to anger against the man. "Go on, mademoiselle," he said. But in spite of himself his voice trembled. "So I arranged with him that we should meet on Wednesday, as Mr. Ricardo heard." "You told him that you would want him on Wednesday," said the judge, quoting Mr. Ricardo's words. "Yes," replied Celia. "I meant that the last word of all these deceptions would have been spoken. I should be free to hear what he had to say to me. You see, monsieur, I was so sure that I knew what it was he had to say to me," and her voice broke upon the words. She recovered herself with an effort. "Then I went home with Madame Dovry. On the morning of Tuesday, however, there came a letter from Adele Tace, of which no trace was afterwards discovered. The letter invited Madame Dovry and Celia to come out to Annecy and dine with her at an hotel there. They could then return together to Aix. The proposal fitted well with Madame Dovry's inclinations. She was in a feverish mood of excitement. "Yes, it will be better that we dine quietly together in a place where there is no noise and no crowd, and where no one knows us," she said, and she looked up the timetable. "There is a train back which reaches Aix at 9 o'clock, she said, "so we need not spoil Servettaz's holiday. His parents will be expecting him," Helene Vauquier added. Accordingly Servettaz left for Chambéry by the 1:50 train from Aix, and later on in the afternoon Madame Dovry and Celia went by train to Annecy. In the one woman's mind was the queer longing that she should appear and speak tonight, in the girl's there was a wish passionate as a cry. "This shall be the last time," she said to herself again and again, "the very last." Meanwhile, Helene Vauquier, it must be held, burnt carefully Adele Tace's letter. She was left in the Villa Rose with the charwoman to keep her company. The charwoman bore testimony that Helene Vauquier certainly did burn a letter in the kitchen stove, and that after she had burned it she sat for a long time rocking herself in a chair, with a smile of great pleasure upon her face, and now and then moistening her lips with her tongue. But Helene Vauquier kept her mouth sealed. Chapter 17. The afternoon of Tuesday. Madame Dovry and Celia found Adele Rossignol, to give Adele Tace the name which she assumed, waiting for them impatiently in the garden of an hotel at Annecy, on the Promenade du Paquier. She was a tall, lithe woman, and she was dressed, by the purse and wish of Helene Vauquier, in a robe and a long coat of sapphire velvet, which toned down the coarseness of her good looks and lent something of elegance to her figure. "So it is Mademoiselle," Adele began, with a smile of raillery, "who is so remarkably clever." "Clever?" answered Celia, looking straight at Adele, as though through her she saw mysteries beyond. She took up her part at once. Since for the last time it had got to be played, there must be no fault in the playing. For her own sake, for the sake of Madame Dovry's happiness, she must carry it off tonight with success. The suspicions of Adele Rossignol must obtain no verification. She spoke in a quiet and most serious voice. Under spirit control no one is clever. One does the bidding of the spirit which controls. "Perfectly," said Adele in a malicious tone. "I only hope you will see to it, Mademoiselle, that some amusing spirits control you this evening and appear before us." "I am only the living gate by which the spirit forms pass from the realm of mind into the world of matter," Celia replied. "Quite so," said Adele comfortably. "Now let us be sensible and dine. We can amuse ourselves with Mademoiselle's rigmaroles afterwards." Madame Dovry was indignant. Celia, for her part, felt humiliated and small. They sat down to their dinner in the garden, but the rain began to fall and drove them indoors. There were a few people dining at the same hour, but none near enough to overhear them. Alike in the garden and the dining room, Adele Tace kept up the same note of ridicule and disbelief. She had been carefully tutored for her work. She was able to cite the stock cases of exposure Les Frères Davenport, as she called them, Aesopia Palladino and Dr. Slade. She knew the precautions which had been taken to prevent trickery and where those precautions had failed. Her whole conversation was carefully planned to one end, and to one end alone. She wished to produce in the minds of her companions so complete an impression of her skepticism that it would seem the most natural thing in the world to both of them that she should insist upon subjecting Celia to the severest tests. The rain ceased, and they took their coffee on the terrace of the hotel. Madame Dovry had been really pained by the conversation of Adele Tace. She had all the missionary zeal of a fanatic. "I do hope, Adele, that we shall make you believe. But we shall. Oh, I am confident we shall." And her voice was feverish. Adele dropped for the moment her tone of raillery. "I am not unwilling to believe," she said, "but I cannot. I am interested, yes. You see how much I have studied the subject. But I cannot believe. I have heard stories of how these manifestations are produced, stories which make me laugh. I cannot help it. The tricks are so easy. A young girl wearing a black frock which does not rustle, it is always a black frock, is it not, because a black frock cannot be seen in the dark, carrying a scarf or veil, with which she can make any sort of headdress if only she is a little clever, and shod in a pair of felt-soled slippers, is shut up in a cabinet or placed behind a screen, and the lights are turned down or out." Adele broke off with a comic shrug of the shoulders. "Bah! It ought not to deceive a child." Celia sat with a face which would grow red. She did not look, but nonetheless she was aware that Madame Dovry was gazing at her with a perplexed frown and some return of her suspicion showing in her eyes. Adele Tace was not content to leave the subject there. "Perhaps," she said, with a smile, "Mlle Celia dresses in that way for a séance?" "Madame shall see tonight," Celia stammered, and Camille Dovry rather sternly repeated her words. "Yes, Adele shall see tonight. I myself will decide what you shall wear, Celia." Adele Tace casually suggested the kind of dress which she would prefer, something light in color with a train, something which will hiss and whisper if Mademoiselle moves about the room. Yes, and I think one of Mademoiselle's big hats, she said. We will have Mademoiselle as modern as possible, so that, when the great ladies of the past appear in the coiffure of their day, we may be sure it is not Mlle Celia who represents them. I will speak to Helene, said Madame Dovry, and Adele Tace was content. There was a particular new dress of which she knew, and it was very desirable that Mlle Celia should wear it tonight. For one thing, if Celia wore it, it would help the theory that she had put it on because she expected that night a lover. For another, with that dress there went a pair of satin slippers which had just come home from a shoemaker at Aix, and which would leave upon soft mold precisely the same imprints as the grey suede shoes which the girl was wearing now. Celia was not greatly disconcerted by Madame Rossignols' precautions. She would have to be a little more careful, and Madame de Montespan would be a little longer in responding to the call of Madame Dovry than most of the other dead ladies of the past had been. But that was all. She was, however, really troubled in another way. All through dinner, at every word of the conversation, she had felt her reluctance towards this séance swelling into a positive disgust. More than once she had felt driven by some uncontrollable power to rise up at the table and cry out to Adele. You are right. It is trickery. There is no truth in it. But she had mastered herself. For opposite to her sat her patroness, her good friend, the woman who had saved her. The flush upon Madame Dovry's cheeks and the agitation of her manner warned Celia how much hung upon the success of this last séance. How much for both of them. And in the fullness of that knowledge a great fear assailed her. She began to be afraid, so strong was her reluctance, that she would not bring her heart into the task. Suppose I failed tonight because I could not force myself to wish not to fail. She thought, and she steeled herself against the thought. Tonight she must not fail. For apart altogether from Madame Dovry's happiness, her own, it seemed, was at stake too. It must be from my lips that Harry learns what I have been, she said to herself, and with the resolve she strengthened herself. I will wear what you please, she said, with a smile. I only wish Madame Rossignol to be satisfied. And I shall be, said Adele, if. She leaned forward in anxiety. She had come to the real necessity of Helene Vauquier's plan. If we abandon as quite laughable the cupboard door and the string across it, if, in a word, Mademoiselle consents that we tie her hand and foot and fasten her securely in a chair, such restraints are usual in the experiments of which I have read. Was there not a medium called Mlle Cook who was secured in this way, and then remarkable things, which I could not believe, were supposed to have happened? Certainly I permit it, said Celia, with indifference, and Madame Dovry cried enthusiastically. Ah, you shall believe tonight in those wonderful things. Adele Tace leaned back. She drew a breath. It was a breath of relief. Then we will buy the cord in Aix, she said. We have some, no doubt, in the house, said Madame Dovry. Adele shook her head and smiled. My dear madam, you are dealing with a skeptic. I should not be content. Celia shrugged her shoulders. Let us satisfy Madame Rossignol, she said. Celia, indeed, was not alarmed by this last precaution. For her it was a test less difficult than the light-colored rustling robe. She had appeared upon so many platforms, had experienced too often the bungling efforts of spectators called up from the audience, to be in any fear. There were very few knots from which her small hands and supple fingers had not learnt long since to extricate themselves. She was aware how much in all these matters the personal equation counted. Men who might, perhaps, have been able to tie knots from which she could not get free were always too uncomfortable and self-conscious, or too afraid of hurting her white arms and wrists, to do it. Women, on the other hand, who had no compunctions of that kind, did not know how. It was now nearly 8 o'clock, the rain still held off. We must go, said Madame Dovry, who for the last half-hour had been continually looking at her watch. They drove to the station and took the train. Once more the rain came down, but it had stopped again before the train steamed into Aix at 9 o'clock. "We will take a cab," said Madame Dovry, "it will save time." "It will do us good to walk, madam," pleaded Adele. The train was full. Adele passed quickly out from the lights of the station in the throng of passengers and waited in the dark square for the others to join her. "It is barely 9. A friend has promised to call at the Villa Rose for me after 11 and drive me back in a motorcar to Geneva, so we have plenty of time." They walked accordingly up the hill, Madame Dovry slowly, since she was stout, and Celia keeping pace with her. Thus it seemed natural that Adele Tace should walk ahead, though a passerby would not have thought she was of their company. At the corner of the Rue du Casino Adele waited for them and said quickly, "Mademoiselle, you can get some cord, I think, at the shop there," and she pointed to the shop of M. Corval. "Madame and I will go slowly on, you, who are the youngest, will easily catch us up." Celia went into the shop, bought the cord, and caught Madame Dovry up before she reached the villa. "Where is Madame Rossignol?" she asked. "She went on," said Camille Dovry. "She walks faster than I do." They passed no one whom they knew, although they did pass one who recognized them, as Perrichet had discovered. They came upon Adele, waiting for them at the corner of the road, where it turns down toward the villa. "It is near here, the Villa Rose?" she asked. "A minute more and we are there." They turned in at the drive, closed the gate behind them, and walked up to the villa. The windows and the glass doors were closed, the latticed shutters fastened. A light burned in the hall. "Helene is expecting us," said Madame Dovry, for as they approached she saw the front door open to admit them, and Helene Vauquier in the doorway. The three women went straight into the little salon, which was ready with the lights up and a small fire burning. Celia noticed the fire with a trifle of dismay. She moved a fire screen in front of it. "I can understand why you do that, mademoiselle," said Adele Rossignol, with a satirical smile. But Madame Dovry came to the girl's help. "She is right, Adele. Light is the great barrier between us and the spirit world," she said solemnly. Meanwhile, in the hall Helene Vauquier locked and bolted the front door. Then she stood motionless, with a smile upon her face and a heart beating high. All through that afternoon she had been afraid that some accident at the last moment would spoil her plan, that Adele Tace had not learned her lesson, that Celia would take fright, that she would not return. Now all those fears were over. She had her victims safe within the villa. The charwoman had been sent home. She had them to herself. She was still standing in the hall when Madame Dovry called aloud impatiently, "Helene! Helene!" And when she entered the salon there was still, as Celia was able to recall, some trace of her smile lingering upon her face. Adele Rossignol had removed her hat and was taking off her gloves. Madame Dovry was speaking impatiently to Celia. "We will arrange the room, dear, while Helene helps you to dress. It will be quite easy. We shall use the recess." And Celia, as she ran up the stairs, heard Madame Dovry discussing with her maid what frock she should wear. She was hot, and she took a hurried bath. When she came from her bathroom she saw with dismay that it was her new pale green evening gown which had been laid out. It was the last which she would have chosen. But she dared not refuse it. She must still any suspicion. She must succeed. She gave herself into Helene's hands. Celia remembered afterwards one or two points which passed barely heeded at the time. Once while Helene was dressing her hair she looked up at the maid in the mirror and noticed a strange and rather horrible grin upon her face, which disappeared the moment their eyes met. Then again, Helene was extraordinarily slow and extraordinarily fastidious that evening. Nothing satisfied her, neither the hang of the girl's skirt, the folds of her sash, nor the arrangement of her hair. "Come, Helene, be quick," said Celia. "You know how Madame hates to be kept waiting at these times. You might be dressing me to go to meet my lover," she added, with a blush and a smile at her own pretty reflection in the glass, and a queer look came upon Helene Vauquier's face. for it was at creating just this very impression that she aimed. "Very well, mademoiselle," said Helene. And even as she spoke, Madame Dovery's voice rang shrill and irritable up the stairs. "Celia! Celia!" "Quick, Helene," said Celia. For she herself was now anxious to have the séance over and done with. But Helene did not hurry. The more irritable Madame Dovery became, the more impatient with Mlle Celia, the less would Mlle Celia dare to refuse the tests Adele wished to impose upon her. But that was not all. She took a subtle and ironic pleasure tonight in decking out her victim's natural loveliness. Her face, her slender throat, her white shoulders, should look their prettiest, her grace of limb and figure should be more alluring than ever before. The same words, indeed, were running through both women's minds. "For the last time," said Celia to herself, thinking of these horrible séances, of which tonight should see the end. "For the last time," said Helene Vauquier too. For the last time she laced the girl's dress. There would be no more patient and careful service for Mlle Celia after tonight. But she should have it, and to spare tonight. She should be conscious that her beauty had never made so strong an appeal, that she was never so fit for life as at the moment when the end had come. One thing Helene regretted. She would have liked Celia, smiling at herself in the glass, to know suddenly what was in store for her. She saw in imagination the color die from the cheeks, the eyes stare wide with terror. "Celia! Celia!" Again the impatient voice rang up the stairs, as Helene pinned the girl's hat upon her fair head. Celia sprang up, took a quick step or two towards the door, and stopped in dismay. The swish of her long satin train must betray her. She caught up the dress and tried again. Even so, the rustle of it was heard. "I shall have to be very careful. You will help me, Helene?" "Of course, mademoiselle. I will sit underneath the switch of the light in the salon. If Madame, your visitor, makes the experiment too difficult, I will find a way to help you," said Helene Vauquier, and as she spoke she handed Celia a long pair of white gloves. "I shall not want them," said Celia. "Madame Dovery ordered me to give them to you," replied Helene. Celia took them hurriedly, picked up a white scarf of tulle, and ran down the stairs. Helene Vauquier listened at the door and heard Madame's voice in feverish anger. "We have been waiting for you, Celia. You have been an age." Helene Vauquier laughed softly to herself, took out Celia's white frock from the wardrobe, turned off the lights, and followed her down to the hall. She placed the cloak just outside the door of the salon. Then she carefully turned out all the lights in the hall and in the kitchen and went into the salon. The rest of the house was in darkness. This room was brightly lit, and it had been made ready. Chapter 18: The Séance. Helene Vauquier locked the door of the salon upon the inside and placed the key upon the mantel shelf, as she had always done whenever a séance had been held. The curtains had been loosened at the sides of the arched recess in front of the glass doors, ready to be drawn across. Inside the recess, against one of the pillars which supported the arch, a high stool without a back, taken from the hall, had been placed, and the back legs of the stool had been lashed with cord firmly to the pillar, so that it could not be moved. The round table had been put in position, with 3 chairs about it. Madame Dovery waited impatiently. Celia stood apparently unconcerned, apparently lost to all that was going on. Her eyes saw no one. Adele looked up at Celia, and laughed maliciously. "Mademoiselle, I see, is in the very mood to produce the most wonderful phenomena. But it will be better, I think, madam," she said, turning to Madame Dovery, "that Mlle Celia should put on those gloves which I see she has thrown onto a chair. It will be a little more difficult for mademoiselle to loosen these cords, should she wish to do so." The argument silenced Celia. If she refused this condition now she would excite Madame Dovery to a terrible suspicion. She drew on her gloves ruefully and slowly, smoothed them over her elbows, and buttoned them. To free her hands with her fingers and wrists already hampered in gloves would not be so easy a task. But there was no escape. Adele Rossignol was watching her with a satiric smile. Madame Dovry was urging her to be quick. Obeying a second order, the girl raised her skirt and extended a slim foot in a pale green silk stocking and a satin slipper to match. Adele was content. Celia was wearing the shoes she was meant to wear. They were made upon the very same last as those which Celia had just kicked off upstairs. An almost imperceptible nod from Helene Vauquier, moreover, assured her. She took up a length of the thin cord. "Now, how are we to begin?" she said awkwardly. "I think I will ask you, mademoiselle, to put your hands behind you." Celia turned her back and crossed her wrists. She stood in her satin frock, with her white arms and shoulders bare, her slender throat supporting her small head with its heavy curls, her big hat, a picture of young grace and beauty. She would have had an easy task that night had there been men instead of women to put her to the test. But the women were intent upon their own ends. Madame Dovry eager for her séance, Adele Tace and Helene Vauquier for the climax of their plot. Celia clenched her hands to make the muscles of her wrists rigid to resist the pressure of the cord. Adele quietly unclasped them and placed them palm to palm. And at once Celia became uneasy. It was not merely the action, significant though it was of Adele's alertness to thwart her, which troubled Celia. But she was extraordinarily receptive of impressions, extraordinarily quick to feel, from a touch, some dim sensation of the thought of the one who touched her. So now the touch of Adele's swift, strong, nervous hands caused her a queer, vague shock of discomfort. It was no more than that at the moment, but it was quite definite as that. "Keep your hands so, please, mademoiselle," said Adele, "your fingers loose." And the next moment Celia winced and had to bite her lips to prevent a cry. The thin cord was wound twice about her wrists, drawn cruelly tight and then cunningly knotted. For 1 second Celia was thankful for her gloves, the next, more than ever she regretted that she wore them. It would have been difficult enough for her to free her hands now, even without them. And upon that a worse thing befell her. "I beg mademoiselle's pardon if I hurt her," said Adele. And she tied the girl's thumbs and little fingers. To slacken the knots she must have the use of her fingers, even though her gloves made them fumble. Now she had lost the use of them altogether. She began to feel that she was in master hands. She was sure of it the next instant. For Adele stood up, and, passing a cord round the upper part of her arms, drew her elbows back. To bring any strength to help her in wriggling her hands free she must be able to raise her elbows. With them trussed in the small of her back she was robbed entirely of her strength. And all the time her strange uneasiness grew. She made a movement of revolt, and at once the cord was loosened. "Mlle Celia objects to my tests," said Adele, with a laugh, to Madame Dovry. "And I do not wonder." Celia saw upon the old woman's foolish and excited face a look of veritable consternation. "Are you afraid, Celia?" she asked. There was anger, there was menace in the voice, but above all these there was fear that her illusions were to tumble about her. Celia heard that note and was quelled by it. This folly of belief, these séances, were the one touch of colour in Madame Dovry's life. And it was just that instinctive need of colour which had made her so easy to delude. How strong the need is, how seductive the proposal to supply it, Celia knew well. She knew it from the experience of her life when the great Fortinbras was at the climax of his fortunes. She had travelled much amongst monotonous, drab towns without character or amusements. She had kept her eyes open. She had seen that it was from the denizens of the dull streets in these towns that the quack religions won their recruits. Madame Dovry's life had been a featureless sort of affair until these experiments had come to colour it. Madame Dovry must at any rate preserve the memory of that colour. "No," she said boldly, "I am not afraid," and after that she moved no more. Her elbows were drawn firmly back and tightly bound. She was sure she could not free them. She glanced in despair at Helene Vauquier, and then some glimmer of hope sprang up. For Helene Vauquier gave her a look, a smile of reassurance. It was as if she said, "I will come to your help." Then, to make security still more sure, Adele turned the girl about as unceremoniously as if she had been a doll, and, passing a cord at the back of her arms, drew both ends round in front and knotted them at her waist. "Now, Celia," said Adele, with a vibration in her voice which Celia had not remarked before. Excitement was gaining upon her, as upon Madame Dovry. Her face was flushed and shiny, her manner peremptory and quick. Celia's uneasiness grew into fear. She could have used the words which Hanaud spoke the next day in that very room. "There is something here which I do not understand." The touch of Adele Tact's hands communicated something to her, something which filled her with a vague alarm. She could not have formulated it if she would, she dared not if she could. She had but to stand and submit. "Now," said Adele. She took the girl by the shoulders and set her in a clear space in the middle of the room, her back to the recess, her face to the mirror, where all could see her. "Now, Celia," she had dropped the mill. And the ironic suavity of her manner, "try to free yourself." For a moment the girl's shoulders worked, her hands fluttered. But they remained helplessly bound. "Ah, you will be content, Adele, tonight," cried Madame Dovry eagerly. But even in the midst of her eagerness, so thoroughly had she been prepared, there lingered a flavor of doubt, of suspicion. In Celia's mind there was still the one desperate resolve. "I must succeed tonight," she said to herself, "I must." Adele Rossignol kneeled on the floor behind her. She gathered in carefully the girl's frock. Then she picked up the long train, wound it tightly round her limbs, pinioning and swathing them in the folds of satin, and secured the folds with a cord about the knees. She stood up again. "Can you walk, Celia?" she asked. "Try." With Helene Vauquier to support her if she fell, Celia took a tiny shuffling step forward, feeling supremely ridiculous. No one, however, of her audience was inclined to laugh. To Madame Dovry the whole business was as serious as the most solemn ceremonial. Adele was intent upon making her not secure. Helene Vauquier was the well-bred servant who knew her place. It was not for her to laugh at her young mistress, in however ludicrous a situation she might be. "Now," said Adele, "we will tie Mademoiselle's ankles, and then we shall be ready for Madame de Montespan." The raillery in her voice had a note of savagery in it now. Celia's vague terror grew. She had a feeling that a beast was waking in the woman, and with it came a growing premonition of failure. Vainly she cried to herself, "I must not fail tonight." But she felt instinctively that there was a stronger personality than her own in that room, taming her, condemning her to failure, influencing the others. She was placed in a chair. Adele passed a cord round her ankles, and the mere touch of it quickened Celia to a spasm of revolt. Her last little remnant of liberty was being taken from her. She raised herself, or rather would have raised herself. But Helene with gentle hands held her in the chair, and whispered under her breath, "Have no fear. Madame is watching." Adele looked fiercely up into the girl's face. "Keep still, Hein, la petite," she cried. And the epithet, little one, was a light to Celia. Till now, upon these occasions, with her black ceremonial dress, her air of aloofness, her vague eyes, and the dignity of her carriage, she had already produced some part of their effect before the séance had begun. She had been wont to sail into the room, distant, mystical. She had her audience already expectant of mysteries, prepared for marvels. Her work was already half done. But now of all that help she was deprived. She was no longer a person aloof, a prophetess, a seer of visions. She was simply a smartly dressed girl of today, trussed up in a ridiculous and painful position, that was all. The dignity was gone. And the more she realized that, the more she was hindered from influencing her audience, the less able she was to concentrate her mind upon them, to will them to favor her. Madame Dovry's suspicions, she was sure, were still awake. She could not quell them. There was a stronger personality than hers at work in the room. The cord bit through her thin stockings into her ankles. She dared not complain. It was savagely tied. She made no remonstrance. And then Helene Vauquier raised her up from the chair and lifted her easily off the ground. For a moment she held her so. If Celia had felt ridiculous before, She knew that she was 10 times more so now. She could see herself as she hung in Helene Vauquier's arms, with her delicate frock ludicrously swathed and swaddled about her legs. But, again, of those who watched her no one smiled. "We have had no such tests as these, madame," Dovry explained, half in fear, half in hope. Adèle Rossignol looked the girl over and nodded her head with satisfaction. She had no animosity towards Celia, she had really no feeling of any kind for her or against her. Fortunately she was unaware at this time that Harry Wethermill had been paying his court to her, or it would have gone worse with Mlle Celia before the night was out. Mlle Celia was just a pawn in a very dangerous game which she happened to be playing, and she had succeeded in engineering her pawn into the desired condition of helplessness. She was content. "Mademoiselle," she said, with a smile, "you wish me to believe. You have now your opportunity." Opportunity. And she was helpless. She knew very well that she could never free herself from these cords without Helene's help. She would fail, miserably and shamefully fail. "It was Madame who wished you to believe," she stammered. And Adèle Rossignol laughed suddenly, a short, loud, harsh laugh, which jarred upon the quiet of the room. It turned Celia's vague alarm into a definite terror. Some magnetic current brought her grave messages of fear. The air about her seemed to tingle with strange menaces. She looked at Adèle. Did they emanate from her? And her terror answered her yes. She made her mistake in that. The strong personality in the room was not Adèle Rossignol, but Helene Vauquier, who held her like a child in her arms. But she was definitely aware of danger, and too late aware of it. She struggled vainly. From her head to her feet she was powerless. She cried out hysterically to her patron. "Madam! Madam! There is something, a presence here, someone who means harm. I know it." And upon the old woman's face there came a look, not of alarm, but of extraordinary relief. The genuine, heartfelt cry restored her confidence in Celia. "Someone, who means harm," she whispered, trembling with excitement. "Ah, Mademoiselle is already under control," said Helene, using the jargon which she had learnt from Celia's lips. Adèle Rossignol grinned. "Yes, La Petite is under control," she repeated, with a sneer, and all the elegance of her velvet gown was unable to hide her any longer from Celia's knowledge. Her grin had betrayed her. She was of the dregs. But Helene Vauquier whispered, "Keep still, mademoiselle. I shall help you." Vauquier carried the girl into the recess and placed her upon the stool. With a long cord Adèle bound her by the arms and the waist to the pillar, and her ankles she fastened to the rung of the stool, so that they could not touch the ground. "Thus we shall be sure that when we hear rapping it will be the spirits, and not the heels, which rap," she said. "Yes, I am contented now." And she added, with a smile, "Celia may even have her scarf," and, picking up a white scarf of tulle which Celia had brought down with her, she placed it carelessly round her shoulders. "Wait," Helene Vauquier whispered in Celia's ear. To the cord about Celia's waist Adèle was fastening a longer line. "I shall keep my foot on the other end of this," she said, "when the lights are out, and I shall know then if our little one frees herself." The three women went out of the recess. And the next moment the heavy silk curtains swung across the opening, leaving Celia in darkness. Quickly and noiselessly the poor girl began to twist and work her hands. But she only bruised her wrists. This was to be the last of the séances. But it must succeed. So much of Madame Dovry's happiness, so much of her own, hung upon its success. Let her fail tonight, she would be surely turned from the door. The story of her trickery and her exposure would run through Aix. And she had not told Harry. It would reach his ears from others. He would never forgive her. To face the old, difficult life of poverty and perhaps starvation again, and again alone, would be hard enough, but to face it with Harry Wethermill's contempt added to its burdens, as the poor girl believed she surely would have to do, no, that would be impossible. Not this time would she turn away from the Seine, because it was so terrible and cold. If she had had the courage to tell him yesterday, he would have forgiven, surely he would. The tears gathered in her eyes and rolled down her cheeks. What would become of her now? She was in pain besides. The cords about her arms and ankles tortured her. And she feared, yes, desperately she feared the effect of the exposure upon Madame Dovry. She had been treated as a daughter, now she was in return to rob Madame Dovry of the belief which had become the passion of her life. "Let us take our seats at the table," she heard Madame Dovry say. "Helene, you are by the switch of the electric light. Will you turn it off?" And upon that Helene whispered, yet so that the whisper reached to Celia and awakened hope. "Wait. I will see what she is doing." The curtains opened, and Helene Vauquier slipped to the girl's side. Celia checked her tears. She smiled imploringly, gratefully. "What shall I do?" asked Helene, in a voice so low that the movement of her mouth rather than the words made the question clear. Celia raised her head to answer, and then a thing incomprehensible to her happened. As she opened her lips, Helene Vauquier swiftly forced a handkerchief in between the girl's teeth, and lifting the scarf from her shoulders wound it tightly twice across her mouth, binding her lips, and made it fast under the brim of her hat behind her head. Celia tried to scream, she could not utter a sound. She stared at Helene with incredulous, horror-stricken eyes. Helene nodded at her with a cruel grin of satisfaction, and Celia realized, though she did not understand, something of the rancor and the hatred which seethed against her in the heart of the woman whom she had supplanted. Helene Vauquier meant to expose her tonight, Celia had not a doubt of it. That was her explanation of Helene Vauquier's treachery, and believing that error, she believed yet another, that she had reached the terrible climax of her troubles. She was only at the beginning of them. "Helene!" cried Madame Dovry sharply. "What are you doing?" The maid instantly slid back into the room. "Mademoiselle has not moved," she said. Celia heard the women settle in their chairs about the table. "Is Madame ready?" asked Helene, and then there was the sound of the snap of a switch. In the salon darkness had come. If only she had not been wearing her gloves, Celia thought, she might possibly have just been able to free her fingers and her supple hands from their bonds. But as it was, she was helpless. She could only sit and wait until the audience in the salon grew tired of waiting and came to her. She closed her eyes, pondering if by any chance she could excuse her failure. But her heart sank within her as she thought of Madame Rossignol's raillery. No, it was all over for her. She opened her eyes, and she wondered. It seemed to her that there was more light in the recess than there had been when she closed them. Very likely her eyes were growing used to the darkness. Yet she ought not to be able to distinguish quite so clearly the white pillar opposite to her. She looked towards the glass doors and understood. The wooden shutters outside the doors were not quite closed. They had been carelessly left unbolted. A chink from lintel to floor let in a grey thread of light. Celia heard the women whispering in the salon, and turned her head to catch the words. "Do you hear any sound?" "No." "Was that a hand which touched me?" "No." "We must wait." And so silence came again, and suddenly there was quite a rush of light into the recess. Celia was startled. She turned her head back again towards the window. The wooden door had swung a little more open. There was a wider chink to let the twilight of that starlit darkness through. And as she looked, the chink slowly broadened and broadened, the door swung slowly back on hinges which were strangely silent. Celia stared at the widening panel of grey light with a vague terror. It was strange that she could hear no whisper of wind in the garden. Why, oh, why was that lattice door opening so noiselessly? Almost she believed that the spirits after all. And suddenly the recess darkened again, and Celia sat with her heart leaping and shivering in her breast. There was something black against the glass doors, a man. He had appeared as silently, as suddenly, as any apparition. He stood blocking out the light, pressing his face against the glass, peering into the room. For a moment the shock of horror stunned her. Then she tore frantically at the cords. All thought of failure, of exposure, of dismissal had fled from her. The three poor women, that was her thought, were sitting unwarned, unsuspecting, defenseless in the pitch blackness of the salon. A few feet away a man, a thief, was peering in. They were waiting for strange things to happen in the darkness. Strange and terrible things would happen unless she could free herself, unless she could warn them. And she could not. Her struggles were mere efforts to struggle, futile, a shiver from head to foot, and noiseless as a shiver. Adèle Rossignol had done her work well and thoroughly. Celia's arms, her waist, her ankles were pinioned, only the bandage over her mouth seemed to be loosening. Then upon horror, horror was added. The man touched the glass doors, and they swung silently inwards. They, too, had been carelessly left unbolted. The man stepped without a sound over the sill into the room. And, as he stepped, fear for herself drove out for the moment from Celia's thoughts, fear for the three women in the black room. If only he did not see her. She pressed herself against the pillar. He might overlook her, perhaps. His eyes would not be so accustomed to the darkness of the recess as hers. He might pass her unnoticed if only he did not touch some fold of her dress. And then, in the midst of her terror, she experienced so great a revulsion from despair to joy that a faintness came upon her, and she almost swooned. She saw who the intruder was. For when he stepped into the recess he turned towards her, and the dim light struck upon him and showed her the contour of his face. It was her lover, Harry Wethermill. Why he had come at this hour, and in this strange way, she did not consider. Now she must attract his eyes, now her fear was lest he should not see her. But he came at once straight towards her. He stood in front of her, looking into her eyes. But he uttered no cry. He made no movement of surprise. Celia did not understand it. His face was in the shadow now and she could not see it. Of course, he was stunned, amazed. But he stood almost as if he had expected to find her there and just in that helpless attitude. It was absurd, of course, but he seemed to look upon her helplessness as nothing out of the ordinary way. And he raised no hand to set her free. A chill struck through her. But the next moment he did raise his hand and the blood flowed again, at her heart. Of course, she was in the darkness. He had not seen her plight. Even now he was only beginning to be aware of it. For his hand touched the bandage over her mouth tentatively. He felt for the knot under the broad brim of her hat at the back of her head. He found it. In a moment she would be free. She kept her head quite still, and then why was he so long, she asked herself. Oh, it was not possible. But her heart seemed to stop, and she knew that it was not only possible, it was true. He was tightening the scarf, not loosening it. The folds bound her lips more surely. She felt the ends drawn close at the back of her head. In a frenzy she tried to shake her head free. But he held her face firmly and finished his work. He was wearing gloves, she noticed with horror, just as thieves do. Then his hands slid down her trembling arms and tested the cord about her wrists. There was something horribly deliberate about his movements. Celia, even at that moment, even with him, had the sensation which had possessed her in the salon. It was the personal equation on which she was used to rely. But neither Adèle nor this stranger was considering her as even a human being. She was a pawn in their game, and they used her, careless of her terror, her beauty, her pain. Then he freed from her waist the long cord which ran beneath the curtain to Adèle Rossignol's foot. Celia's first thought was one of relief. He would jerk the cord unwittingly. They would come into the recess and see him. And then the real truth flashed in upon her blindingly. He had jerked the cord, but he had jerked it deliberately. He was already winding it up in a coil as it slid noiselessly across the polished floor beneath the curtains towards him. He had given a signal to Adèle Rossignol. All that woman's skepticism and precaution against trickery had been a mere blind, under cover of which she had been able to pack the girl away securely without arousing her suspicions. Helene Vauquier was in the plot, too. The scarf at Celia's mouth was proof of that. As if to add proof to proof, she heard Adèle Rossignol speak in answer to the signal. "Are we all ready? Have you got Madame Dovery's left hand, Helene?" "Yes, madam," answered the maid. "And I have her right hand. Now give me yours, and thus we are in a circle about the table. Celia, in her mind, could see them sitting about the round table in the darkness, Madame Dovry between the two women, securely held by them. And she herself could not utter a cry, could not move a muscle to help her. Wethermill crept back on noiseless feet to the window, closed the wooden doors, and slid the bolts into their sockets. Yes, Helene Vauquier was in the plot. The bolts and the hinges would not have worked so smoothly but for her. Darkness again filled the recess instead of the grey twilight. But in a moment a faint breath of wind played upon Celia's forehead, and she knew that the man had parted the curtains and slipped into the room. Celia let her head fall towards her shoulder. She was sick and faint with terror. Her lover was in this plot, the lover in whom she had felt so much pride, for whose sake she had taken herself so bitterly to task. He was the associate of Adèle Rossignol, of Helene Vauquier. He had used her, Celia, as an instrument for his crime. All their hours together at the Villa des Fleurs, here tonight was their culmination. The blood buzzed in her ears and hammered in the veins of her temples. In front of her eyes the darkness whirled, flecked with fire. She would have fallen, but she could not fall. Then, in the silence, a tambourine jangled. There was to be a séance tonight, then, and the séance had begun. In a dreadful suspense she heard Madame Dovry speak. Chapter 19 Helene explains. And what she heard made her blood run cold. Madame Dovry spoke in a hushed, awestruck voice. There is a presence in the room. It was horrible to Celia that the poor woman was speaking the jargon which she herself had taught to her. I will speak to it, said Madame Dovry, and raising her voice a little, she asked, Who are you that come to us from the spirit world? No answer came, but all the while Celia knew that Wethermill was stealing noiselessly across the floor towards that voice which spoke this professional patter with so simple a solemnity. Answer, she said. And the next moment she uttered a little shrill cry, a cry of enthusiasm. Fingers touch my forehead, now they touch my cheek, now they touch my throat. And upon that the voice ceased. But a dry, choking sound was heard, and a horrible scuffling and tapping of feet upon the polished floor, a sound most dreadful. They were murdering her, murdering an old, kind woman silently and methodically in the darkness. The girl strained and twisted against the pillar furiously, like an animal in a trap. But the coils of rope held her, the scarf suffocated her. The scuffling became a spasmodic sound, with intervals between, and then ceased altogether. A voice spoke, a man's voice, Wethermill's. But Celia would never have recognized it, it had so shrill and fearful an intonation. That's horrible, he said, and his voice suddenly rose to a scream. Hush! Helene Vauquier whispered sharply. What's the matter? She fell against me, her whole weight. Oh! You are afraid of her? Yes, yes. And in the darkness Wethermill's voice came querulously between long breaths. Yes, now I am afraid of her. Helene Vauquier replied again contemptuously. She spoke aloud and quite indifferently. Nothing of any importance whatever, one would have gathered, had occurred. I will turn on the light, she said. And through the chinks in the curtain the bright light shone. Celia heard a loud rattle upon the table, and then fainter sounds of the same kind, and as a kind of horrible accompaniment there ran the labored breathing of the man, which broke now and then with a sobbing sound. They were stripping Madame Dovry of her pearl necklace, her bracelets, and her rings. Celia had a sudden importunate vision of the old woman's fat, podgy hands loaded with brilliants. A jingle of keys followed. That's all, Helene Vauquier said. She might have just turned out the pocket of an old dress. There was the sound of something heavy and inert falling with a dull crash upon the floor. A woman laughed, and again it was Helene Vauquier. Which is the key of the safe? Asked Adèle. And Helene Vauquier replied. That one? Celia heard someone drop heavily into a chair. It was Wethermill, and he buried his face in his hands. Helene went over to him and laid her hand upon his shoulder and shook him. Do you go and get her jewels out of the safe, she said, and she spoke with a rough friendliness. You promised you would blindfold the girl, he cried hoarsely. Mlle Celia laughed. Did I? She said. Well, what does it matter? There would have been no need to, and his voice broke off shudderingly. Wouldn't there? And what of us, Adele and me? She knows certainly that we are here. Come, go and get the jewels. The key of the door's on the mantelshelf. While you are away we too will arrange the pretty baby in there. She pointed to the recess, her voice rang with contempt. Wethermill staggered across the room like a drunkard, and picked up the key in trembling fingers. Celia heard it turn in the lock, and the door bang. Wethermill had gone upstairs. Celia leaned back, her heart fainting within her. Arrange. It was her turn now. She was to be arranged. She had no doubt what sinister meaning that innocent word concealed. The dry, choking sound, the horrid scuffling of feet upon the floor, were in her ears. And it had taken so long, so terribly long. She heard the door open again and shut again. Then steps approached the recess. The curtains were flung back, and the two women stood in front of her, the tall Adele Rossignol with her red hair and her coarse good looks and her sapphire dress, and the hard-featured, sallow maid. The maid was carrying Celia's white coat. They did not mean to murder her, then. They meant to take her away, and even then a spark of hope lit up in the girl's bosom. For even with her illusions crushed she still clung to life with all the passion of her young soul. The two women stood and looked at her, and then Adele Rossignol burst out laughing. Vauquer approached the girl, and Celia had a moment's hope that she meant to free her altogether, but she only loosed the cords which fixed her to the pillar and the high stool. Mademoiselle will pardon me for laughing, said Adele Rossignol politely, but it was Mademoiselle who invited me to try my hand. And really, for so smart a young lady, Mademoiselle looks too ridiculous. She lifted the girl up and carried her back writhing and struggling into the salon. The whole of the pretty room was within view, but in the embrasure of a window something lay dreadfully still and quiet. Celia held her head averted. But it was there, and, though it was there, all the while the women joked and laughed, Adele Rossignol feverishly, Helene Vauquer with a real glee most horrible to see. I beg Mademoiselle not to listen to what Adele is saying, exclaimed Helene. And she began to ape in a mincing, extravagant fashion the manner of a saleswoman in a shop. Mademoiselle has never looked so ravishing. This style is the last word of fashion. It is what there is of most chic. Of course, Mademoiselle understands that the costume is not intended for playing the piano. Nor, indeed, for the ballroom. It leaps to one's eyes that dancing would be difficult. Nor is it intended for much conversation. It is a costume for a mood of quiet reflection. But I assure Mademoiselle that for pretty young ladies who are the favorites of rich old women it is the style most recommended by the criminal classes. All the woman's bitter rancor against Celia, hidden for months beneath a mask of humility, burst out and ran riot now. She went to Adele Rossignol's help, and they flung the girl face downwards upon the sofa. Her face struck the cushion at one end, her feet the cushion at the other. The breath was struck out of her body. She lay with her bosom heaving. Helene Vauquer watched her for a moment with a grin, paying herself now for her respectful speeches and attendance. Yes, lie quietly and reflect, little fool, she said savagely. Were you wise to come here and interfere with Helene Vauquer? Hadn't you better have stayed and danced in your rags at Montmartre? Are the smart frocks and the pretty hats and the good dinners worth the price? Ask yourself these questions, my dainty little friend. She drew up a chair to Celia's side, and sat down upon it comfortably. I will tell you what we are going to do with you, Mlle Celia. Adele Rossignol and that kind gentleman, M. Wethermill, are going to take you away with them. You will be glad to go, won't you, dearie? For you love M. Wethermill, don't you? Oh, they won't keep you long enough for you to get tired of them. Do not fear. But you will not come back, Mlle Celia. No, you have seen too much tonight. And everyone will think that Mlle Celia helped to murder and rob her benefactress. They are certain to suspect someone, so why not you, pretty one? Celia made no movement. She lay trying to believe that no crime had been committed, that that lifeless body did not lie against the wall. And then she heard in the room above a bed wheeled roughly from its place. The two women heard it too, and looked at one another. "He should look in the safe," said Vauquer. "Go and see what he is doing." And Adèle Rossignol ran from the room. As soon as she was gone, Vauquer followed to the door, listened, closed it gently, and came back. She stooped down. "Mlle Celia," she said, in a smooth, silky voice, which terrified the girl more than her harsh tones, "there is just one little thing wrong in your appearance, one tiny little piece of bad taste, if mademoiselle will pardon a poor servant the expression. I did not mention it before Adèle Rossignol, she is so severe in her criticism, is she not? But since we are alone, I will presume to point out to mademoiselle that those diamond eardrops which I see peeping out under the scarf are a little ostentatious in her present predicament. They are a provocation to thieves. Will mademoiselle permit me to remove them?" She caught her by the neck and lifted her up. She pushed the lace scarf up at the side of Celia's head. Celia began to struggle furiously, convulsively. She kicked and writhed, and a little tearing sound was heard. One of her shoe buckles had caught in the thin silk covering of the cushion and slit it. Helene Vauquer let her fall. She felt composedly in her pocket, and drew from it an aluminium flask, the same flask which Lemaire was afterward to snatch up in the bedroom in Geneva. Celia stared at her in dread. She saw the flask flashing in the light. She shrank from it. She wondered what new horror was to grip her. Helene unscrewed the top and laughed pleasantly. "Mlle Celia is under control," she said. "We shall have to teach her that it is not polite in young ladies to kick." She pressed Celia down with a hand upon her back, and her voice changed. "Lie still," she commanded savagely. "Do you hear? Do you know what this is, Mlle Celia?" And she held the flask towards the girl's face. "This is vitriol, my pretty one. Move, and I'll spoil these smooth white shoulders for you. How would you like that?" Celia shuddered from head to foot, and, burying her face in the cushion, lay trembling. She would have begged for death upon her knees rather than suffer this horror. She felt Vauquer's fingers lingering with a dreadful caressing touch upon her shoulders and about her throat. She was within an ace of the torture, the disfigurement, and she knew it. She could not pray for mercy. She could only lie quite still, as she was bidden, trying to control the shuddering of her limbs and body. "It would be a good lesson for Mlle Celia," Helene continued slowly. "I think that if Mlle Celia will forgive the liberty I ought to inflict it. One little tilt of the flask and the satin of these pretty shoulders." She broke off suddenly and listened. Some sound heard outside had given Celia a respite, perhaps more than a respite. Helene set the flask down upon the table. Her avarice had got the better of her hatred. She roughly plucked the earrings out of the girl's ears. She hid them quickly in the bosom of her dress with her eye upon the door. She did not see a drop of blood gather on the lobe of Celia's ear and fall into the cushion on which her face was pressed. She had hardly hidden them away before the door opened and Adèle Rossignol burst into the room. "What is the matter?" asked Vauquer. "The safe's empty. We have searched the room. We have found nothing," she cried. "Everything is in the safe," Helene insisted. "No." The two women ran out of the room and up the stairs. Celia, lying on the settee, heard all the quiet of the house change to noise and confusion. It was as though a tornado raged in the room overhead. Furniture was tossed about and over the room, feet stamped and ran, locks were smashed in with heavy blows. For many minutes the storm raged. Then it ceased, and she heard the accomplices clattering down the stairs without a thought of the noise they made. They burst into the room. Harry Wethermill was laughing hysterically, like a man off his head. He had been wearing a long dark overcoat when he entered the house, now he carried the coat over his arm. He was in a dinner jacket, and his black clothes were dusty and disordered. "It's all for nothing," he screamed rather than cried. "Nothing but the one necklace and a handful of rings." In a frenzy, he actually stooped over the dead woman and questioned her. "Tell us, where did you hide them?" he cried. "The girl will know," said Helene. Wethermill rose up and looked wildly at Celia. "Yes, yes," he said. He had no scruple, no pity any longer for the girl. There was no gain from the crime unless she spoke. He would have placed his head in the guillotine for nothing. He ran to the writing table, tore off half a sheet of paper, and brought it over with a pencil to the sofa. He gave them to Vauquier to hold, and drawing out the sofa from the wall slipped in behind. He lifted up Celia with Rossignols' help, and made her sit in the middle of the sofa with her feet upon the ground. He unbound her wrists and fingers, and Vauquier placed the writing pad and the paper on the girl's knees. Her arms were still pinioned above the elbows, she could not raise her hands high enough to snatch the scarf from her lips. But with the pad held up to her she could write. Where did she keep her jewels? "Quick! Take the pencil and write," said Wethermill, holding her left wrist. Vauquier thrust the pencil into her right hand, and awkwardly and slowly her gloved fingers moved across the page. "I do not know," she wrote, and, with an oath, Wethermill snatched the paper up, tore it into pieces, and threw it down. "You have got to know," he said, his face purple with passion, and he flung out his arm as though he would dash his fist into her face. But as he stood with his arm poised there came a singular change upon his face. "Did you hear anything?" he asked in a whisper. All listened, and all heard in the quiet of the night a faint click, and after an interval they heard it again, and after another but shorter interval yet once more. "That's the gate," said Wethermill in a whisper of fear, and a pulse of hope stirred within Celia. He seized her wrists, crushed them together behind her, and swiftly fastened them once more. Adèle Rossignol sat down upon the floor, took the girl's feet upon her lap, and quietly wrenched off her shoes. "The light!" cried Wethermill in an agonized voice, and Helena Vauquier flew across the room and turned it off. All three stood holding their breath, straining their ears in the dark room. On the hard gravel of the drive outside footsteps became faintly audible, and grew louder and came near. Adèle whispered to Vauquier, "Has the girl a lover?" And Helene Vauquier, even at that moment, laughed quietly. All Celia's heart and youth rose in revolt against her extremity. If she could only free her lips. The footsteps came round the corner of the house, they sounded on the drive outside the very window of this room. One cry, and she would be saved. She tossed back her head and tried to force the handkerchief out from between her teeth. But Wethermill's hand covered her mouth and held it closed. The footsteps stopped, a light shone for a moment outside. The very handle of the door was tried. Within a few yards help was there, help and life. Just a frail latticed wooden door stood between her and them. She tried to rise to her feet. Adèle Rossignol held her legs firmly. She was powerless. She sat with one desperate hope that, whoever it was who was in the garden, he would break in. Were it even another murderer, he might have more pity than the callous brutes who held her now, he could have no less. But the footsteps moved away. It was the withdrawal of all hope. Celia heard Wethermill behind her draw a long breath of relief. That seemed to Celia almost the cruelest part of the whole tragedy. They waited in the darkness until the faint click of the gate was heard once more. Then the light was turned up again. "We must go," said Wethermill. All the three of them were shaken. They stood looking at one another, white and trembling. They spoke in whispers. To get out of the room, to have done with the business that had suddenly become their chief necessity. Adèle picked up the necklace and the rings from the satin-wood table and put them into a pocket bag which was slung at her waist. "Hippolyte shall turn these things into money," she said. "He shall set about it tomorrow. We shall have to keep the girl now until she tells us where the rest is hidden." "Yes, keep her," said Helene. "We will come over to Geneva in a few days, as soon as we can. We will persuade her to tell." She glanced darkly at the girl. Celia shivered. "Yes, that's it," said Wethermill. "But don't harm her. She will tell of her own will. You will see. The delay won't hurt now. We can't come back and search for a little while." He was speaking in a quick, agitated voice. And Adele agreed. The desire to be gone had killed even their fury at the loss of their prize. Sometime they would come back, but they would not search now, they were too unnerved. "Helene," said Wethermill, "get to bed. I'll come up with the chloroform and put you to sleep." Helene Vauquier hurried upstairs. It was part of her plan that she should be left alone in the villa chloroformed. Thus only could suspicion be averted from herself. She did not shrink from the completion of the plan now. She went, the strange woman, without a tremor to her ordeal. Wethermill took the length of rope which had fixed Celia to the pillar. "I'll follow," he said, and as he turned he stumbled over the body of Madame Dovry. With a shrill cry he kicked it out of his way and crept up the stairs. Adele Rossignol quickly set the room in order. She removed the stool from its position in the recess, and carried it to its place in the hall. She put Celia's shoes upon her feet, loosening the cord from her ankles. Then she looked about the floor and picked up here and there a scrap of cord. In the silence the clock upon the mantel-shelf chimed the 11:15. She screwed the stopper on the flask of vitriol very carefully, and put the flask away in her pocket. She went into the kitchen and fetched the key of the garage. She put her hat on her head. She even picked up and drew on her gloves, afraid lest she should leave them behind, and then Wethermill came down again. Adele looked at him inquiringly. "It is all done," he said, with a nod of the head. "I will bring the car down to the door. Then I'll drive you to Geneva and come back with the car here." He cautiously opened the latticed door of the window, listened for a moment, and ran silently down the drive. Adele closed the door again, but she did not bolt it. She came back into the room. She looked at Celia, as she lay back upon the settee, with a long glance of indecision. And then, to Celia's surprise, for she had given up all hope, the indecision in her eyes became pity. She suddenly ran across the room and knelt down before Celia. With quick and feverish hands she untied the cord which fastened the train of her skirt about her knees. At first Celia shrank away, fearing some new cruelty. But Adele's voice came to her ears, speaking with remorse. "I can't endure it," she whispered. "You are so young, too young to be killed." The tears were rolling down Celia's cheeks. Her face was pitiful and beseeching. "Don't look at me like that, for God's sake, child," Adele went on, and she chafed the girl's ankles for a moment. "Can you stand?" she asked. Celia nodded her head gratefully. After all, then, she was not to die. It seemed to her hardly possible. But before she could rise a subdued whir of machinery penetrated into the room, and the motorcar came slowly to the front of the villa. "Keep still," said Adele hurriedly, and she placed herself in front of Celia. Wethermill opened the wooden door, while Celia's heart raced in her bosom. "I will go down and open the gate," he whispered. "Are you ready?" "Yes." Wethermill disappeared, and this time he left the door open. Adele helped Celia to her feet. For a moment she tottered, then she stood firm. "Now run," whispered Adele. "Run, child, for your life." Celia did not stop to think whither she should run, or how she should escape from Wethermill's search. She could not ask that her lips and her hands might be freed. She had but a few seconds. She had one thought: to hide herself in the darkness of the garden. Celia fled across the room, sprang wildly over the sill, ran, tripped over her skirt, steadied herself, and was swung off the ground by the arms of Harry Wethermill. "There we are," he said, with his shrill, wavering laugh. "I opened the gate before." And suddenly Celia hung inert in his arms. The light went out in the salon. Adele Rossignol, carrying Celia's cloak, stepped out at the side of the window. "She has fainted," said Wethermill. "Wipe the mold off her shoes and off yours too, carefully. I don't want them to think this car has been out of the garage at all." Adele stooped and obeyed. Wethermill opened the door of the car and flung Celia into a seat. Adele followed and took her seat opposite the girl. Wethermill stepped carefully again onto the grass, and with the toe of his shoe scraped up and ploughed the impressions which he and Adele Rossignol had made on the ground, leaving those which Celia had made. He came back to the window. "She has left her footmarks clear enough," he whispered. "There will be no doubt in the morning that she went of her own free will." Then he took the chauffeur's seat, and the car glided silently down the drive and out by the gate. As soon as it was on the road it stopped. In an instant Adèle Rossignol's head was out of the window. "What is it?" she exclaimed in fear. Wethermill pointed to the roof. He had left the light burning in Helene Vauquier's room. "We can't go back now," said Adèle in a frantic whisper. "No, it is over. I daren't go back." And Wethermill jammed down the lever. The car sprang forward, and humming steadily over the white road devoured the miles. But they had made their one mistake. Chapter 20: The Geneva Road. The car had nearly reached Annecy before Celia woke to consciousness, and even then she was dazed. She was only aware that she was in the motorcar and traveling at a great speed. She lay back, drinking in the fresh air. Then she moved, and with the movement came to her recollection and the sense of pain. Her arms and wrists were still bound behind her, and the cords hurt her like hot wires. Her mouth, however, and her feet were free. She started forward, and Adèle Rossignol spoke sternly from the seat opposite. "Keep still. I am holding the flask in my hand. If you scream, if you make a movement to escape, I shall fling the vitriol in your face," she said. Celia shrank back, shivering. I won't, she whispered piteously. Her spirit was broken by the horrors of the night's adventure. She lay back and cried quietly in the darkness of the carriage. The car dashed through Annecy. It seemed incredible to Celia that less than 6 hours ago she had been dining with Madame Dovry and the woman opposite, who was now her jailer. Madame Dovry lay dead in the little salon, and she herself, she dared not think what lay in front of her. She was to be persuaded, that was the word, to tell what she did not know. Meanwhile her name would be execrated through Aix as the murderess of the woman who had saved her. Then suddenly the car stopped. There were lights outside. Celia heard voices. A man was speaking to Wethermill. She started and saw Adèle Tace's arm flash upwards. She sank back in terror, and the car rolled on into the darkness. Adèle Tace drew a breath of relief. The one point of danger had been passed. They had crossed the Pont de la Caille, they were in Switzerland. Some long while afterwards the car slackened its speed. By the side of it Celia heard the sound of wheels and of the hooves of a horse. A single-horsed closed landau had been caught up as it jogged along the road. The motorcar stopped. Close by the side of it the driver of the landau reined in his horse. Wethermill jumped down from the chauffeur's seat, opened the door of the landau, and then put his head in at the window of the car. "Are you ready? Be quick." Adèle turned to Celia. "Not a word, remember." Wethermill flung open the door of the car. Adèle took the girl's feet and drew them down to the step of the car. Then she pushed her out. Wethermill caught her in his arms and carried her to the landau. Celia dared not cry out. Her hands were helpless, her face at the mercy of that grim flask. Just ahead of them the lights of Geneva were visible, and from the lights a silver radiance overspread a patch of sky. Wethermill placed her in the landau. Adèle sprang in behind her and closed the door. The transfer had taken no more than a few seconds. The landau jogged into Geneva. The motor turned and sped back over the 50 miles of empty road to Aix. As the motorcar rolled away, courage returned for a moment to Celia. The man, the murderer, had gone. She was alone with Adèle Rossignol in a carriage moving no faster than an ordinary trot. Her ankles were free, the gag had been taken from her lips. If only she could free her hands and choose a moment when Adèle was off her guard, she might open the door and spring out onto the road. She saw Adèle draw down the blinds of the carriage, and very carefully, very secretly, Celia began to work her hands behind her. She was an adept, no movement was visible, but, on the other hand, no success was obtained. The knots had been too cunningly tied. And then Madame Rossignol touched a button at her side in the leather of the carriage. The touch turned on a tiny lamp in the roof of the carriage, and she raised a warning hand to Celia. Now keep very quiet." Right through the empty streets of Geneva the landau was quietly driven. Adele had peeked from time to time under the blind. There were few people in the streets. Once or twice a sergeant de ville was seen under the light of a lamp. Celia dared not cry out. Over against her, persistently watching her, Adele Rossignol sat with the open flask clenched in her hand, and from the vitriol Celia shrank with an overwhelming terror. The carriage drove out from the town and along the western edge of the lake. "Now listen," said Adele. "As soon as the landau stops, the door of the house opposite to which it stops will open. I shall open the carriage door myself and you will get out. You must stand close by the carriage door until I have got out. I shall hold this flask ready in my hand. As soon as I am out you will run across the pavement into the house. You won't speak or scream." Adele Rossignol turned out the lamp and 10 minutes later the carriage passed down the little street and attracted Madame Gobin's notice. Marthe Gobin had lit no light in her room. Adele Rossignol peered out of the carriage. She saw the houses in darkness. She could not see the busybody's face watching the landau from a dark window. She cut the cords which fastened the girl's hands. The carriage stopped. She opened the door. Celia sprang out onto the pavement. She sprang so quickly that Adele Rossignol caught and held the train of her dress. But it was the fear of the vitriol which had made her spring so nimbly. It was that, too, which made her run so lightly and quickly into the house. The old woman who acted as servant, Jeanne Tace, received her. Celia offered no resistance. The fear of vitriol had made her supple as a glove. Jeanne hurried her down the stairs into the little parlor at the back of the house, where supper was laid, and pushed her into a chair. Celia let her arms fall forward on the table. She had no hope now. She was friendless and alone in a den of murderers, who meant first to torture, then to kill her. She would be held up to execration as a murderess. No one would know how she had died or what she had suffered. She was in pain, and her throat burned. She buried her face in her arms and sobbed. All her body shook with her sobbing. Jeanne Rossignol took no notice. She treated Celia just as the others had done. Celia was la petite, against whom she had no animosity, by whom she was not to be touched to any tenderness. La petite had unconsciously played her useful part in their crime. But her use was ended now, and they would deal with her accordingly. She removed the girl's hat and cloak and tossed them aside. "Now stay quiet until we are ready for you," she said. And Celia, lifting her head, said in a whisper, "Water." The old woman poured some from a jug and held the glass to Celia's lips. "Thank you," whispered Celia gratefully, and Adele came into the room. She told the story of the night to Jeanne, and afterwards to Hippolyte when he joined them. "And nothing gained," cried the older woman furiously. "And we have hardly a 5-franc piece in the house." "Yes, something," said Adele. "A necklace, a good one, some good rings, and bracelets. And we shall find out where the rest is hid, from her." And she nodded at Celia. The 3 people ate their supper, and, while they ate it, discussed Celia's fate. She was lying with her head bowed upon her arms at the same table, within a foot of them. But they made no more of her presence than if she had been an old shoe. Only once did one of them speak to her. "Stop your whimpering," said Hippolyte roughly. "We can hardly hear ourselves talk." He was for finishing with the business altogether tonight. "It's a mistake," he said. "There's been a bungle, and the sooner we are rid of it the better. There's a boat at the bottom of the garden." Celia listened and shuddered. He would have no more compunction over drowning her than he would have had over drowning a blind kitten. "It's cursed luck," he said. "But we have got the necklace, that's something. That's our share, do you see? The young spark can look for the rest." But Helene Vauquier's wish prevailed. She was the leader. They would keep the girl until she came to Geneva. They took her upstairs into the big bedroom overlooking the lake. Adele opened the door of the closet, where a truckle bed stood, and thrust the girl in. "This is my room," she said warningly, pointing to the bedroom. "Take care I hear no noise. You might shout yourself hoarse, my pretty one, no one else would hear you. But I should, and afterwards, we should no longer be able to call you my pretty one, eh? And with a horrible playfulness she pinched the girl's cheek, then with old Jeanne's help she stripped Celia and told her to get into bed. I'll give her something to keep her quiet, said Adele, and she fetched her morphia needle and injected a dose into Celia's arm. Then they took her clothes away and left her in the darkness. She heard the key turn in the lock, and a moment after the sound of the bedstead being drawn across the doorway. But she heard no more, for almost immediately she fell asleep. She was awakened sometime the next day by the door opening. Old Jeanne brought her in a jug of water and a roll of bread, and locked her up again. And a long time afterwards she brought her another supply. Yet another day had gone, but in that dark cupboard Celia had no means of judging time. In the afternoon the newspaper came out with the announcement that Madame Dovrie's jewellery had been discovered under the boards. Hippolyta brought in the newspaper, and, cursing their stupidity, they sat down to decide upon Celia's fate. That, however, was soon arranged. They would dress her in everything which she wore when she came, so that no trace of her might be discovered. They would give her another dose of morphia, sew her up in a sack as soon as she was unconscious, row her far out onto the lake, and sink her with a weight attached. They dragged her out from the cupboard, always with the threat of that bright aluminium flask before her eyes. She fell upon her knees, imploring their pity with the tears running down her cheeks, but they sewed the strip of sacking over her face so that she should see nothing of their preparations. They flung her on the sofa, secured her as Hanaud had found her, and, leaving her in the old woman's charge, sent down Adele for her needle and Hippolyta to get ready the boat. As Hippolyta opened the door he saw the launch of the Chef de la Sûreté glide along the bank. Chapter 21 Hanaud explains. This is the story as Mr. Ricardo wrote it out from the statement of Celia herself and the confession of Adele Rossignol. Obscurities which had puzzled him were made clear. But he was still unaware how Hanaud had worked out the solution. You promised me that you would explain, he said, when they were both together after the trial was over at Aix. The two men had just finished luncheon at the Circle and were sitting over their coffee. Hanaud lighted a cigar. There were difficulties, of course, he said, the crime was so carefully planned. The little details, such as the footprints, the absence of any mud from the girl's shoes in the carriage of the motor car, the dinner at Annecy, the purchase of the cord, the want of any sign of a struggle in the little salon, were all carefully thought out. Had not one little accident happened, and one little mistake been made in consequence, I doubt if we should have laid our hands upon one of the gang. We might have suspected Wethermill, we should hardly have secured him, and we should very likely never have known of the Tace family. That mistake was, as you no doubt are fully aware, the failure of Wethermill to discover Madame Dovrie's jewels, said Ricardo at once. No, my friend, answered Hanaud. That made them keep Mlle Celia alive. It enabled us to save her when we had discovered the whereabouts of the gang. It did not help us very much to lay our hands upon them. No, the little accident which happened was the entrance of our friend Perrichet into the garden while the murderers were still in the room. Imagine that scene, Ricardo. The rage of the murderers at their inability to discover the plunder for which they had risked their necks, the old woman crumpled up on the floor against the wall, the girl writing laboriously with fettered arms I do not know under threats of torture, and then in the stillness of the night the clear, tiny click of the gate and the measured, relentless footsteps. No wonder they were terrified in that dark room. What would be their one thought? Why, to get away, to come back perhaps later, when Mlle Celia should have told them what, by the way, she did not know, but in any case to get away now. So they made their little mistake, and in their hurry they left the light burning in the room of Helene Vauquier, and the murder was discovered 7 hours too soon for them. 7 hours, said Mr. Ricardo. Yes. The household did not rise early. It was not until 7 that the charwoman came. It was she who was meant to discover the crime. By that time the motor car would have been back 3 hours ago in its garage. Servatas, the chauffeur, would have returned from Chambéry sometime in the morning. He would have cleaned the car, he would have noticed that there was very little petrol in the tank, as there had been when he had left it on the day before. He would not have noticed that some of his many tins which had been full yesterday were empty today. We should not have discovered that about 4 in the morning the car was close to the Villa Rose and that it had travelled, between midnight and 5 in the morning, 150 kilometers. But you had already guessed Geneva, said Ricardo. At luncheon, before the news came that the car was found, you had guessed it. It was a shot, said Hanaud. The absence of the car helped me to make it. It is a large city and not very far away, a likely place for people with the police at their heels to run to earth in. But if the car had been discovered in the garage, I should not have made that shot. Even then I had no particular conviction about Geneva. I really wished to see how Wethermill would take it. He was wonderful. He sprang up. He betrayed nothing but surprise. You showed no less surprise than he did, my good friend. What I was looking for was one glance of fear. I did not get it. Yet you suspected him, even then you spoke of brains and audacity. You told him enough to hinder him from communicating with the red-haired woman in Geneva. You isolated him. Yes, you suspected him. Let us take the case from the beginning. When you first came to me, as I told you, the commissaire had already been with me. There was an interesting piece of evidence already in his possession. Adolphe Roule, who saw Wethermill and Vauquier together close by the casino and overheard that cry of Wethermill's, "It is true, I must have money," had already been with his story to the commissaire. I knew it when Harry Wethermill came into the room to ask me to take up the case. That was a bold stroke, my friend. The chances were 100 to 1 that I should not interrupt my holiday to take up a case because of your little dinner party in London. Indeed, I should not have interrupted it had I not known Adolphe Roule's story. As it was, I could not resist. Wethermill's very audacity charmed me. Oh yes, I felt that I must pit myself against him. So few criminals have spirit, Ricardo. It is deplorable how few. But Wethermill. See in what a fine position he would have been if only I had refused. He himself had been the first to call upon the first detective in France. And his argument? He loved Mlle Celia. Therefore she must be innocent. How he stuck to it. People would have said, love is blind, and all the more they would have suspected Mlle Celia. Yes, but they loved the blind lover. Therefore all the more would it have been impossible for them to believe Harry Wethermill had any share in that grim crime. Mr. Ricardo drew his chair closer into the table. I will confess to you, he said, that I thought Mlle Celia was an accomplice. It is not surprising, said Hanaud. Someone within the house was an accomplice. We start with that fact. The house had not been broken into. There was Mlle Celia's record as Helene Vauquier gave it to us, and a record obviously true. There was the fact that she had got rid of servitors. There was the maid upstairs very ill from the chloroform. What more likely than that Mlle Celia had arranged a séance, and then when the lights were out had admitted the murderer through that convenient glass door? There were, besides, the definite imprints of her shoes, said Mr. Ricardo. Yes, but that is precisely where I began to feel sure that she was innocent, replied Hanaud dryly. All the other footmarks had been so carefully scored and ploughed up that nothing could be made of them. Yet those little ones remained so definite, so easily identified, and I began to wonder why these, too, had not been cut up and stamped over. The murderers had taken, you see, an excessive precaution to throw the presumption of guilt upon Mlle Celia rather than upon Vauquier. However, there the footsteps were. Mlle Celia had sprung from the room as I described to Wethermill. But I was puzzled. Then in the room I found the torn-up sheet of notepaper with the words, "Je ne sais pas," in Mademoiselle's handwriting. The words might have been spirit writing, they might have meant anything. I put them away in my mind. But in the room the settee puzzled me. And again I was troubled, greatly troubled. Yes, I saw that. And not you alone, said Hanaud, with a smile. Do you remember that loud cry Wethermill gave when we returned to the room and once more I stood before the settee? Oh, he turned it off very well. I had said that our criminals in France were not very gentle with their victims, and he pretended that it was in fear of what Mlle Celia might be suffering which had torn that cry from his heart. But it was not so. He was afraid, deadly afraid, not for Mlle Celia, but for himself. He was afraid that I had understood what these cushions had to tell me. "What did they tell you?" asked Ricardo. "You know now," said Hanaud. "They were 2 cushions, both indented, and indented in different ways. The one at the head was irregularly indented, something shaped had pressed upon it. It might have been a face, it might not, and there was a little brown stain which was fresh and which was blood. The second cushion had 2 separate impressions, and between them the cushion was forced up in a thin ridge, and these impressions were more definite. I measured the distance between the 2 cushions, and I found this, that supposing, and it was a large supposition, the cushions had not been moved since those impressions were made, a girl of Mlle Celia's height lying stretched out upon the sofa would have her face pressing down upon one cushion and her feet and insteps upon the other. Now, the impressions upon the second cushion and the thin ridge between them were just the impressions which might have been made by a pair of shoes held close together. But that would not be a natural attitude for any one, and the mark upon the head cushion was very deep. Supposing that my conjectures were true, then a woman would only lie like that because she was helpless, because she had been flung there, because she could not lift herself, because, in a word, her hands were tied behind her back and her feet fastened together. Well, then, follow this train of reasoning, my friend. Suppose my conjectures, and we had nothing but conjectures to build upon, were true, the woman flung upon the sofa could not be Mlle Celia, for she would have said so, she could have had no reason for concealment. But it must be Mlle Celia. There was the slit in the one cushion and the stain on the other which, of course, I had not accounted for. There was still, too, the puzzle of the footsteps outside the glass doors. If Mlle Celia had been bound upon the sofa, how came she to run with her limbs free from the house? There was a question not easy to answer. "Yes," said Mr. Ricardo. "Yes, but there was also another question. Suppose that Mlle Celia was, after all, the victim, not the accomplice. Suppose she had been flung tied upon the sofa, suppose that somehow the imprint of her shoes upon the ground had been made, and that she had afterwards been carried away, so that the maid might be cleared of all complicity. In that case it became intelligible why the other footprints were scored out and hers left. The presumption of guilt would fall upon her. There would be proof that she ran hurriedly from the room and sprang into a motor car of her own free will. But, again, if that theory were true, then Mlle Celia was the accomplice and not Mlle Celia. I follow that. Then I found an interesting piece of evidence with regard to the strange woman who came. I picked up a long red hair, a very important piece of evidence about which I thought it best to say nothing at all. It was not Mlle Celia's hair, which is fair, nor Vauquier's, which is black, nor Madame Douvry's, which is dyed brown, nor the charwoman's, which is grey. It was, therefore, the visitor's. Well, we went upstairs to Mlle Celia's room. "Yes," said Mr. Ricardo eagerly. "We are coming to the pot of cream." In that room we learnt that Mlle Celia, at her own request, had already paid it a visit. It is true the commissaire said that he had kept his eye on her the whole time. But none the less from the window he saw me coming down the road, and that he could not have done, as I made sure, unless he had turned his back upon Vauquier and leaned out of the window. Now at the time I had an open mind about Vauquier. On the whole I was inclined to think she had no share in the affair. But either she or Mlle Celia had, and perhaps both. But one of them, yes. That was sure. Therefore I asked what drawers she touched after the commissaire had leaned out of the window. For if she had any motive in wishing to visit the room she would have satisfied it when the commissaire's back was turned. He pointed to a drawer, and I took out a dress and shook it, thinking that she may have wished to hide something. But nothing fell out. On the other hand, however, I saw some quite fresh grease marks, made by fingers, and the marks were wet. I began to ask myself how it was that Mlle Celia, who had just been helped to dress by the nurse, had grease upon her fingers. Then I looked at a drawer which she had examined first of all. There were no grease marks on the clothes she had turned over before the commissaire leaned out of the window, therefore it followed that during the few seconds when he was watching me she had touched grease. I looked about the room, and there on the dressing table close by the chest of drawers was a pot of cold cream. That was the grease Helene Vauquier had touched. And why, if not to hide some small thing in it which, firstly, she dared not keep in her own room, which, secondly, she wished to hide in the room of Mlle Celia, and which, thirdly, she had not had an opportunity to hide before. Now bear those three conditions in mind, and tell me what the small thing was. Mr. Ricardo nodded his head. I know now, he said. You told me. The earrings of Mlle Celia. But I should not have guessed it at the time. Nor could I, at the time, said Hanaud. I kept my open mind about Helene Vauquier, but I locked the door and took the key. Then we went and heard Vauquier's story. The story was clever, because so much of it was obviously, indisputably true. The account of the séances, of Madame d'Auvry's superstitions, her desire for an interview with Madame de Montespan, such details are not invented. It was interesting, too, to know that there had been a séance planned for that night. The method of the murder began to be clear. So far she spoke the truth. But then she lied. Yes, she lied, and it was a bad lie, my friend. She told us that the strange woman Adele had black hair. Now I carried in my pocketbook proof that that woman's hair was red. Why did she lie, except to make impossible the identification of that strange visitor? That was the first full step taken by Helene Vauquier. Now let us take the second. I thought nothing of her rancor against Mlle Celia. To me it was all very natural. She, the hard peasant woman no longer young, who had been for years the confidential servant of Madame d'Auvry, and no doubt had taken her levy from the impostors who preyed upon her credulous mistress, certainly she would hate this young and pretty outcast, whom she has to wait upon, whose hair she has to dress. Vauquier, she would hate her. But if by any chance she were in the plot and the lie seemed to show she was, then the séances showed me new possibilities. For Helene used to help Mlle Celia. Suppose that the séance had taken place, that this skeptical visitor with the red hair professed herself dissatisfied with Vauquier's method of testing the medium, had suggested another way, Mlle Celia could not object, and there she would be neatly and securely packed up beyond the power of offering any resistance, before she could have a suspicion that things were wrong. It would be an easy little comedy to play. And if that were true, why, there were my sofa cushions partly explained. Yes, I see, cried Ricardo, with enthusiasm. You are wonderful. Hanaud was not displeased with his companion's enthusiasm. But wait a moment. We have only conjectures so far, and one fact, that Helene Vauquier lied about the color of the strange woman's hair. Now we get another fact. Mlle Celia was wearing buckles on her shoes. And there is my slit in the sofa cushions. For when she is flung onto the sofa, what will she do? She will kick, she will struggle. Of course it is conjecture. I do not as yet hold pig-headedly to it. I am not yet sure that Mlle Celia is innocent. I am willing at any moment to admit that the facts contradict my theory. But, on the contrary, each fact that I discover helps it to take shape. Now I come to Helene Vauquier's second mistake. On the evening when you saw Mlle Celia in the garden behind the baccarat rooms, you noticed that she wore no jewelry except a pair of diamond eardrops. In the photograph of her which Wethermill showed me, again she was wearing them. Is it not, therefore, probable that she usually wore them? When I examined her room, I found the case for those earrings. The case was empty. It was natural, then, to infer that she was wearing them when she came down to the séance. Yes. Well, I read a description, a carefully written description of the missing girl, made by Helene Vauquier after an examination of the girl's wardrobe. There is no mention of the earrings. So I asked her, was she not wearing them? Helene Vauquier was taken by surprise. How should I know anything of Mlle Celia's earrings? She hesitated. She did not quite know what answer to make. Now, why? Since she herself dressed Mlle Celia, and remembers so very well all she wore. Why does she hesitate? Well, there is a reason. She does not know how much I know about those diamond eardrops. She is not sure whether we have not dipped into that pot of cold cream and found them. Yet without knowing she cannot answer. So now we come back to our pot of cold cream. Yes, cried Mr. Ricardo. They were there. Wait a bit, said Hanaud. Let us see how it works out. Remember the conditions. Vauquer has some small thing which she must hide, and which she wishes to hide in Mlle Celia's room. For she admitted that it was her suggestion that she should look through Mademoiselle's wardrobe. For what reason does she choose the girl's room, except that if the thing were discovered that would be the natural place for it? It is, then, something belonging to Mlle Celia. There was a second condition we laid down. It was something Vauquer had not been able to hide before. It came, then, into her possession last night. Why could she not bide it last night? Because she was not alone. There were the man and the woman, her accomplices. It was something, then, which she was concerned in hiding from them. It is not rash to guess, then, that it was some piece of the plunder of which the other two would have claimed their share, and a piece of plunder belonging to Mlle Celia. Well, she has nothing but the diamond eardrops. Suppose Vauquer is left alone to guard Mlle Celia while the other two ransack Madame Dovery's room. She sees her chance. The girl cannot stir hand or foot to save herself. Vauquer tears the eardrops in a hurry from her ears, and there I have my drop of blood just where I should expect it to be. But now follow this. Vauquer hides the earrings in her pocket. She goes to bed in order to be chloroformed. She knows that it is very possible that her room will be searched before she regains consciousness, or before she is well enough to move. There is only one place to hide them in, only one place where they will be safe. In bed with her. But in the morning she must get rid of them, and a nurse is with her. Hence the excuse to go to Mlle Celia's room. If the eardrops are found in the pot of cold cream, it would only be thought that Mlle Celia had herself hidden them there for safety. Again it is conjecture, and I wish to make sure. So I tell Vauquer she can go away, and I leave her unwatched. I have her driven to the depot instead of to her friends, and searched. Upon her is found the pot of cream, and in the cream Mlle Celia's eardrops. She has slipped into Mlle Celia's room, as, if my theory was correct, she would be sure to do, and put the pot of cream into her pocket. So I am now fairly sure that she is concerned in the murder. We then went to Madame Dovery's room and discovered her brilliants and her ornaments. At once the meaning of that agitated piece of handwriting of Mlle Celia's becomes clear. She is asked where the jewels are hidden. She cannot answer, for her mouth, of course, is stopped. She has to write. Thus my conjectures get more and more support. And, mind this, one of the two women is guilty, Celia or Vauquer. My discoveries all fit in with the theory of Celia's innocence. But there remain the footprints, for which I found no explanation. You will remember I made you all promise silence as to the finding of Madame Dovery's jewelry. For I thought, if they have taken the girl away so that suspicion may fall on her and not on Vauquer, they mean to dispose of her. But they may keep her so long as they have a chance of finding out from her Madame Dovery's hiding place. It was a small chance, but our only one. The moment the discovery of the jewelry was published, the girl's fate was sealed, were my theory true. Then came our advertisement and Madame Gobin's written testimony. There was one small point of interest which I will take first, her statement that Adele was the Christian name of the woman with the red hair, that the old woman who was the servant in that house in the suburb of Geneva called her Adele, just simply Adele. That interested me, for Helene Vauquer had called her Adele too when she was describing to us the unknown visitor. Adele was what Madame Dovery called her. Yes, said Ricardo. Helene Vauquer made a slip there. She should have given her a false name. Hanaud nodded. It is the one slip she made in the whole of the business. Nor did she recover herself very cleverly. For when the commissaire pounced upon the name, she at once modified her words. She only thought now that the name was Adele, or something like it. But when I went on to suggest that the name in any case would be a false one, at once she went back upon her modifications. And now she was sure that Adele was the name used. I remembered her hesitation when I read Mart Gobbin's letter. They helped to confirm me in my theory that she was in the plot, and they made me very sure that it was an Adele for whom we had to look. So far well. But other statements in the letter puzzled me. For instance, she ran lightly and quickly across the pavement into the house, as though she were afraid to be seen. Those were the words, and the woman was obviously honest. What became of my theory then? The girl was free to run, free to stoop and pick up the train of her gown in her hand, free to shout for help in the open street if she wanted help. No, that I could not explain until that afternoon, when I saw Mlle Celia's terror-stricken eyes fixed upon that flask, as Lemaire poured a little out and burnt a hole in the sack. Then I understood well enough. The fear of vitriol. Hanaud gave an uneasy shudder. And it is enough to make anyone afraid. That I can tell you. No wonder she lay still as a mouse upon the sofa in the bedroom. No wonder she ran quickly into the house. Well, there you have the explanation. I had only my theory to work upon even after Madame Gobbin's evidence. But as it happened, it was the right one. Meanwhile, of course, I made my inquiries into Wethermill's circumstances. My good friends in England helped me. They were precarious. He owed money in Aix, money at his hotel. We knew from the motorcar that the man we were searching for had returned to Aix. Things began to look black for Wethermill. Then you gave me a little piece of information. Exclaimed Ricardo, with a start. Yes. You told me that you walked up to the hotel with Harry Wethermill on the night of the murder and separated just before 10. A glance into his rooms which I had, you will remember that when we had discovered the motorcar I suggested that we should go to Harry Wethermill's rooms and talk it over. That glance enabled me to see that he could very easily have got out of his room onto the veranda below and escaped from the hotel by the garden quite unseen. For you will remember that whereas your rooms look out to the front and onto the slope of Mont Revard, Wethermill's look out over the garden and the town of Aix. In a quarter of an hour or 20 minutes he could have reached the Villa Rose. He could have been in the salon before 10:30, and that is just the hour which suited me perfectly, and, as he got out unnoticed, so he could return. So he did return. My friend, there are some interesting marks upon the windowsill of Wethermill's room and upon the pillar just beneath it. Take a look, Ricardo, when you return to your hotel. But that was not all. We talked of Geneva in Mr. Wethermill's room, and of the distance between Geneva and Aix. Do you remember that? Yes, replied Ricardo. Do you remember too that I asked him for a road book? Yes, to make sure of the distance. I do. But it was not to make sure of the distance that I asked for the road book, my friend. I asked in order to find out whether Harry Wethermill had a road book at all which gave a plan of the roads between here and Geneva. And he had. He handed it to me at once and quite naturally. I hope that I took it calmly, but I was not at all calm inside. For it was a new road book, which, by the way, he bought a week before, and I was asking myself all the while, now what was I asking myself, Ricardo? No, said Ricardo, with a smile. I am growing wary. I will not tell you what you were asking yourself, Hanaud. For even were I right you would make out that I was wrong, and leap upon me with injuries and jibes. No, you shall drink your coffee and tell me of your own accord. Well, said Hanaud, laughing, I will tell you. I was asking myself, why does a man who owns no motorcar, who hires no motorcar, go out into Aix and buy an automobilist's road map? With what object? And I found it an interesting question. Harry Wethermill was not the man to go upon a walking tour, eh? Oh, I was obtaining evidence. But then came an overwhelming thing, the murder of Mart Gobbin. We know now how he did it. He walked beside the cab, put his head in at the window, asked, "Have you come in answer to the advertisement?" and stabbed her straight to the heart through her dress. The dress and the weapon which he used would save him from being stained with her blood. He was in your room that morning, when we were at the station. As I told you, he left his glove behind. He was searching for a telegram in answer to your advertisement. Or he came to sound you. He had already received his telegram from Hippolyta. He was like a fox in a cage, snapping at everyone, twisting vainly this way and that way, risking everything and everyone to save his precious neck. Mlle Gobin was in the way. She is killed. Mlle Celia is a danger. So Mlle Celia must be suppressed. And off goes a telegram to the Geneva paper, handed in by a waiter from the cafe at the station of Chambéry before 5 o'clock. Whether Mlle went to Chambéry that afternoon when we went to Geneva. Once we could get him on the run, once we could so hurry and bustle him that he must take risks. Why, we had him, and that afternoon he had to take them. So that even before Mlle Gobin was killed you were sure that Mlle was the murderer. Hanaud's face clouded over. You put your finger on a sore place, Ricardo. I was sure, but I still wanted evidence to convict. I left him free, hoping for that evidence. I left him free, hoping that he would commit himself. He did, but well, let us talk of someone else. What of Mlle Celia? Ricardo drew a letter from his pocket. I have a sister in London, a widow, he said. She is kind. I, too, have been thinking of what will become of Mlle Celia. I wrote to my sister, and here is her reply. Mlle Celia will be very welcome. Hanaud stretched out his hand and shook Ricardo's warmly. She will not, I think, be for very long a burden. She is young. She will recover from this shock. She is very pretty, very gentle. If no one comes forward whom she loves and who loves her, I myself, who was her papa for one night, will be her husband forever. He laughed inordinately at his own joke. It was a habit of Hanaud's. Then he said gravely, but I am glad, Ricardo, for Mlle Celia's sake that I came to your amusing dinner party in London. Mr. Ricardo was silent for a moment. Then he asked, and what will happen to the condemned? To the women? Imprisonment for life. And to the man? Hanaud shrugged his shoulders. Perhaps the guillotine. Perhaps New Caledonia. How can I say? I am not the President of the Republic. The end. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really hoped you enjoyed it. There will be more to come. Please subscribe not to miss out on what is next. I will be looking forward to your return. The music is by Madfan from Pixabay. To support this and other artists, go to pixabay.com. Sheila.